The actual truth is that the native tribes were in a constant state of war long before any white man set foot on these shores. Violence was an integral part of so-called indigenous culture. Get the hell over it. Are you saying we should just get over and move on atrocities that were committed hundreds of years ago? Yeah. Basically, just like get over it. The guy in the last video was complaining about something that supposedly happened in 1637. That's nearly 400 years ago. You cannot actually be angry about something that happened 400 years ago. If you are, then you are insane.
All right, folks, so this is a follow-up of our last video where we reacted to that article of Native American activists. Basically, one of them claimed that we should just not celebrate Thanksgiving altogether. The other one said, well, we should celebrate it, but we need to decolonize it. We need to turn it into a truthsgiving. It's just so ridiculous. Matt Walsh actually reacted the other day to the same exact article, and I thought he had a pretty masterful response to the entire situation that perhaps needs to be reacted to here today, and we'll play it and kind of talk about it because honestly, it's probably it's probably a lot better than the one I did in the last video. You know, I just kind of rolled my eyes and called the people ridiculous and like pointing out these people are just not normal. These are just like miserable people. It's Thanksgiving. Shut up. You know, seriously. And I do still think that is valid. But in terms of actually, you know, dissecting the arguments of these people about American history and all this stuff, like I said, I thought Matt did this pretty masterfully. And so we'll react to it here today, and I'll pause periodically to give my own thoughts on it. But here is him talking about that same exact article that called for a decolonization of Thanksgiving. Here you go.
First of all, it's true that the traditional story of Thanksgiving that they used to tell young children in school decades ago is simplistic.
Right, because you know, this is what an argument they bring up a lot, which is, well, you know, that thing you learned about in elementary school, you know, it's not the full or true story, right? It's like, okay, yeah, we learned about it in elementary school. Turns out a lot of things are like that in school, right? Even in high school, when I was in chemistry, we learned an entire model for what an atom looked like. And then you learn later on, actually, no, none of that is true. The Bohr model's not true. None of it's actually true. So why did you teach it to us? I don't know, but sometimes you teach things, you know, okay, whatever.
And there's probably a certain element of legend to it.
True.
Every country has its legends. Every country has its foundational myths.
Including Native Americans.
There is nothing sinister about that. Stories are passed down through the generations. Details are lost over time. Sometimes details are added, all to preserve the central theme or message in the story. Every culture has its legends. And really, our understanding of all historical events from centuries ago is, at the very least, incomplete.
Right.
We don't have camera footage to review. So we can only go by what people involved said happened, or what people who talked to people involved said happened. So none of this is revelatory. We all understand this. Okay, so every time they say, well, did you know what they told you in second grade about Thanksgiving? Did you know that wasn't the whole story? Of course it's not the whole story, you idiot. It was in second grade. I assume it wasn't the whole story. None of that changes the basic meaning of Thanksgiving or undermines or debunks the basic central story of Thanksgiving. Besides, the old simplistic story of the holiday has now been replaced with a new simplistic story. In the new simplistic version,
100% true. Right, because this whole narrative of stolen land, you know, and this is basically what the way they want to teach history is white people just came to this continent and massacred a bunch of innocent Native Americans, millions of them on end. The natives never fought back. The natives were just these peace-loving hippies, and they were all just sitting around smoking weed, basically. And then all of a sudden, you know, these white settlers came and just slaughtered them all. That's not true. That's not true at all. But you read these articles, you listen to it, that's all that they say, right? So they say when you talk about Thanksgiving in a pro-American sense, you're lacking the nuance of the conversation. Well, they don't have the nuance to it either, because the stolen land narrative is inaccurate and missing a lot of details, right? The idea of this like benevolent Native American where everyone who lived on this continent before the white people showed up were, like I said, a bunch of peace-loving hippies, that is not true. That, of course, even to the degree to which there were a few peace-loving hippies on this continent, it totally lacks what they accuse us of lacking, which is the nuance in it all, right? But great point, of course.
Version. The native tribes were all a bunch of peaceful, tree-hugging hippies in tune with the earth and nature, singing Kumbaya when they were viciously slaughtered by the white man. The actual truth is that the native tribes were in a constant state of war long before any white man set foot on these shores. Violence was an integral part of so-called indigenous culture, all indigenous cultures, because it was not just one culture. Okay, these were disparate tribes stretched out all over the hemisphere, and violence was an integral part of all of them, no exceptions.
Folks, it is obviously a very unstable time in the world right now, which is why it's never been a better time to invest your money in safe, stable assets like gold, silver, and precious metals. And whether it's converting a retirement account into a physical gold IRA or just using some spare cash to buy a little bit of gold to have, our friends at Noble Gold Investments can help you do this. Noble Gold has been helping customers like you secure their financial security with gold and silver for years now and have achieved an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. So especially if you're brand new to investing or especially investing in gold, our friends at Noble Gold can walk you through the entire process, and you know you can trust that A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. So if you're the least bit interested, do me a favor, because they do a lot to support this channel and are a big reason these videos are possible. Go check out the link at vincedaogold.com. You can fill out a form there to put your contact information, or if you want to call them directly and speak to a real person, give them a call at 877-646-5347. Again, if you're just the least bit interested in investing in gold and silver, our friends at Noble Gold will give you the rundown and options, and your contributions, obviously, to Noble Gold go back into this channel. So vincedaogold.com or dial the number. Check out our friends at Noble Gold. One thing I would add is the article we're reacting to here, at least one of the guys who writes the piece in that is a Lakota Indian. Okay. And we bring this up all the time on the channel because for some reason, a lot of these activists come from the Lakota. I don't know the correlation there, but you look at the history of the Lakota. I mean, they were even feared by other Indian tribes for being very brutal and savage, not just in the fact that they conquered and quote unquote stole land from everyone, including the Black Hills where Mount Rushmore currently is. They literally quote unquote stole that from the Cheyenne in the 1600s and now claim it's their rightful and they should get it back. But beyond that, you know, they were literally known for things like the ghost dance and scalping and massacring entire villages of women and children. That is the history of the Lakota, right? But now you have modern Lakota activists who will now turn around and say, we were a bunch of peace-loving hippies, but you Americans who came and conquered us and actually ended their practices of mass genocide and ritual human sacrifice, you are the bad guys. So just going to point that out, right? Is you want to talk about the history of violence. One of the guys who wrote that article, ironically, is a Lakota, which, you know, I'm not making that up. Research for yourself the history of the Lakota tribe and their practices and what they were all about. They were a war tribe. That's what they were known for, right? They didn't really even build much. They were like nomadic warriors that just went around and conquered stuff. That's all they basically did, right? So,
as for their contact with European settlers, sometimes the contact was peaceful on both sides. On some occasions, the settlers committed atrocities. On some occasions, the Indians committed atrocities. On some occasions, the atrocities on either side were basically unprovoked. On plenty of occasions, there was a mutual combat between the two sides.
Right.
The Pequot people mentioned in that last video were not helpless victims. They were at war with the colonists. They lost the war. They were conquered. Such is the way of history.
Yep.
Such is the law of conquest, which the Pequot, like all Indians, well understood. They had done plenty of conquering themselves. In fact, and this was a very common occurrence, the colonists had Indian allies in their fight against the Pequot. And the tribes allied with the colonists were the ones that the Pequot had previously conquered and slaughtered. And so they were a little bit miffed at the Pequot. Of course, the Native American dude up on stage for the day of mourning festivities.
And of course, the people who claim we need to delve into the nuances of history and really understand the stuff, they intentionally omit all those details. I wonder why. Because even if they claim, oh, it's about just telling the truth about history. No, it's not. It's that they want to replace it with their simplistic and inaccurate narrative.
or any of the rest of them, they don't mention any of this. They never do. Nope. They never acknowledge even one of the many, many, many countless instances of Indian tribes inflicting horrific, savage violence on innocent colonists, including women and children.
Right.
And on each other.
Right.
They never acknowledge it because they don't want you to realize that this land was not stolen. It was conquered fair and square. Mm-hmm. The previous conquerors of this land were then themselves conquered.
Yep.
That's the way it goes. Second, even if it's true that most of the settlers were peaceful and that oftentimes they were the victims of brutal violence by the Indians and that there was mutual combat between the two sides and the Indians simply lost the battle, they lost the war. So it was a war and they lost. Sorry, but you lost.
And the wars took place hundreds of years ago. Could you imagine the conversation on any other continent arguing that, we should redraw territory and lines and have people leave lands and all this stuff all over wars that took place hundreds of years ago? Could you imagine, let's say, in England, right? If you look at the history, I believe actually the modern royal family and the modern leadership of England doesn't come from the original Anglo-Saxons, the Normans, right? Could you imagine in England how ridiculous the conversation would be of like, we need to return to the, pre-medieval, overthrow the Norman royal family and all this? Like, it would be a ridiculous conversation. Could you imagine even going back further than that and saying most of Europe needs to be returned to the Roman Empire, to Italy in the modern? Could you imagine that? The conversation sounds incredibly ridiculous in any other continent. But for some reason, this idea in America is mainstream, where, crying about wars that took place hundreds of years ago and deciding that they should be seen as valid reasons to redraw the maps and return all this stuff. Suddenly, for some reason, only in the Americas is it a normal conversation to have, or is it taken seriously? And of course, people will say, well, the reason for that is because the settlers came over from Europe. Okay, guess what? Anyone in history ever who conquered one place had to have come from another place. That's why they conquered the place, right? So it's silly.
Even if all that's true, does it justify whatever actual atrocities the settlers committed? No, of course it doesn't. Do I deny that such atrocities were committed? No, of course I don't.
Yeah, nobody does.
But here's what I do say about those cases. And I'll put it as gently as possible. Get the hell over it.
Yep.
Move on.
Yep.
Just
100%.
Yeah, move on. Are you saying we should just get over and move on atrocities that were committed hundreds of years ago? Yeah. Basically, just get over it.
Yeah. Right.
The guy in the last video was complaining about something that supposedly happened in 1637. That's nearly 400 years ago. You cannot actually be angry about something that happened 400 years ago. If you are, then you are insane. You are an insane person if you're actually mad about stuff that happened 4 centuries ago. That is 16 generations. We are as close to the Pilgrims today as the Pilgrims were to the Crusades. That's the amount of time we're dealing with. And yet we have people in this country so young that 9/11 is ancient history to them, pretending to be distraught and devastated by events that occurred 150 years before the Declaration of Independence was written.
Yeah, and he literally says, if you read that article, he's like, we're enduring the trauma of what they did in 1637. Like, yeah, is that what you do? You wake up every day and you think you're, the reason my wife is cheating on me is because of what they did in 1637. Like, are these normal? These are not normal people, okay?
Do you realize how crazy that is? Pretending to be actively traumatized about stuff that happened centuries ago is psychotic. Like, imagine if you found me in the corner sobbing and you asked me what was wrong, and I said, well, I'm just really upset about the burning of the Library of Alexandria in 48 BC. Just haven't gotten over it. By the way, I've got news for you. 400 years ago, almost everybody's life was brutal and tragic. If we're supposed to be sad about misfortunes suffered by people we never met way back in the distant past, then we will never stop being sad. Almost everyone everywhere suffered greatly back in those days. There are plenty of people still suffering greatly today. If you want to empathize with people's pain, maybe choose people who are currently living, not people who were decomposed in the ground 400 years ago.
Well, here's the thing. The point I made in the last video was essentially that these are simply just miserable, unhappy, depressed people, right? And I think you see that. Because if you seriously are sitting around being genuinely miserable about things that did not even happen in your lifetime or your parents' lifetime or your grandparents' lifetime, and that makes you miserable, then a lot of things in life must make you miserable. And the point I made in the last video was, why should miserable, unhappy people be put in charge of making the ideas for civilization? You want civilization to be happy and not miserable, but you put miserable, unhappy people in charge of it. What do you think is going to happen there, right? And I think that's true.
Not people who died 300 years before the automobile was invented. Now, in final analysis, history contains an essentially infinite amount of suffering and atrocities and outrages and injustices.
Yeah.
It also contains heroism and sacrifice and courage and achievement. It is up to us to decide which of those things in our national history we will focus on.
Yeah.
I contend that the healthiest category to focus on, the thing that you focus on if you want to be a thriving and happy and healthy society, is the latter. Which isn't to say that we outright deny and never discuss the former. Of course, we acknowledge that bad things were done in our history. We shouldn't try to erase that from the history books, and nobody is. But ultimately, you will look back on your history with pride and gratitude, or with resentment and despair. You will focus on the triumph or the tragedy. The people of all other nations across the world, or at least the non-Western world, they choose to focus on the triumph of their ancestors, which breeds national pride and patriotism and gratitude. In the modern West, we are the only ones who have decided to basically ignore all of the positive and concentrate almost exclusively on the bad. So much so that even our day of Thanksgiving has become, at least in some corners, times of mourning.
Well, again, I think that goes back to the point I made. When you put depressed, mentally ill, unhappy, miserable people, at the forefront of society, then society is forced to kind of indulge and cheer on their misery. And that's at its core, that's what it's really about. It's not about Native Americans or colonization or history. Those are excuses for miserable people to force their misery onto everyone else. And I think on some levels, the idea to them of Thanksgiving is in itself, oh my gosh, people being happy with their families. We hate this. We're antisocial. We don't want to see our family. We don't, you know what I mean?
And what has that strategy gotten us? It's only made us resentful, sullen, depressed, ungrateful. It has made us worse people and our country a worse country. That's why I will not partake in this historical self-flagellation. Instead, I celebrate the incredible valor and intrepidness of my ancestors. I take pride in this country's history and in those who made it possible for this country to exist in the first place. I am happy that they came here and that they conquered. I am thankful for their conquest. I will give thanks for it on Thanksgiving and for so much else.
Yeah. I don't have much else to add. I mean, that sums it up, really, does it not? Don't let miserable, awful people ruin things that are happy and good about the world. That's what they're trying to do. Don't let them. Have a happy Thanksgiving. And by the way, thank you to the colonists and the settlers for building the United States. Okay, you want to talk about? I'm thankful for them. Anyways, with that said, leave a like before you go. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. We will be returning to the live streams and stuff next week. And have a happy Thanksgiving. I already said that. And until next time, Alpha Moves only. God bless. Have a very good day and peace.